Kurt led Tesserent for 7 years and only left the organisation quite recently after the acquisition by Thales late last year. During that tenure, he had a whole bunch of different spokesperson responsibilities. That was everything from financial information that was in, the quarterly 4Cs that listed companies have to put out, other ASX announcements, and other commentary on breaking news as it happened, which in the world of cyber seems to happen with a great deal of frequency. He also authored a huge number of bylines, showing the world that he's actually not just someone who's out there just reacting to what's going on, but actually leading and thinking about what's going on and acting as a thought leader. And he also, something that's quite unusual in a lot of senior executives, he empowered a lot of his team to take on spokesperson responsibilities. So he, made sure that they got the right training and empowered them to actually go out and be spokespeople, it's quite unusual. Often spokespeople like to hog the spotlight themselves, but Kurt was great at sharing that around and making sure lots of people in the organization around him had the opportunities. So we're going to talk to him about what it's like to be a company leader and media spokesperson, some of the lessons he learned along the way, and how other leaders can succeed when they're working with the business. Before we start, I just want to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today. I want to recognise that these have always been lands where learning has taken place through storytelling and the sharing experiences, which is why we're here today. We're really approaching today's webinar in that spirit, and we want to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So let's kick things off, Kurt. How long were you acting as a media spokesperson? How long have you done that for?
Thanks, Anthony. Just before I say that, I left Tesserent at the end of last year, but it was 18 months before that we were acquired by Thales. So just wanted to say that I didn't run away straight away. I worked with the French guys for a year and a half. Look, scarily, it's been 25 years. It was in the dawn of the internet that late 90s, I think, when I was at Cisco, that I started as a media spokesperson.
Wow, that's a long time. So what were the first times like? Like, were you packing it the first time you started doing this? Were you worried about it? How did you feel?
Yeah, well, it was multinational companies didn't want you to speak about anything that was, unless it was to help get them the next deal, right? Or the next pipeline opportunity. And you weren't allowed to say, you obviously got a lot of questions about what was going on in multinational companies. Of course, you didn't really know all the finance stuff, and it was all pretty tightly controlled. But I do remember the first interview was with a chap called Alan Kohler, who's quite a renowned Australian journalist. I think he now is with the ABC, does the finance report on the ABC. Back then, he was the Australian IT guy, and he was asking me about the Telstra broadband rollout and why it was going so slow. And of course, at Cisco, we wanted them to go faster and use a lot of our technology. So it was quite a delicate discussion trying to say, yes, they probably are slower than what's happening in the US and so on, but here are the reasons. So that was quite a nerve-wracking, I was also responsible for the Telstra account at the time. So yeah, you walked a very fine line there.
Yeah, it's good to see that the discussion around, the speed of broadband rollouts just hasn't changed in that 25 years either. We're still having that fight. We still have those discussions going on in the media.
Yeah.
So when you think back to when you started doing this, and you said, 25 years or so ago, and you think about the more recent interviews you've done, how do you compare them? Did your style change? Did the way you approach those interviews change? What were some of the differences?
Well, it's like anything. The more you do something, practice makes perfect. You get more comfortable with it. We did a fair bit of media spokesperson training. Like, there was a training company I recall back then, and it was quite sort of stilted. It was a traditional sort of training course. I suspect, working with Media-Wize and other players over that period of time, you get much better preparation once you know the process, and you know what you're trying to get out of the. You really have to understand what you're trying to get out of the actual media engagement.
So you kind of talked there a little bit about media training, just briefly. I'd be curious. I'm curious for me, but also maybe I think people are. What makes good media training versus when you said some of it might have been a bit stilted and not quite right? What's the difference?
Oh, I think role playing is important, and I think the media training. So, I know the work that I did with you sometimes, Anthony. You've actually got to be tougher than what the real journalists are going to be. Train hard, fight easy was the saying we had back in Defence Force. I think it's the same. You've actually got to anticipate the absolute worst question or the worst scenario, because you probably rarely ever get that.
So that gives us a really good segue to what I was going to ask you next, and that's like, What have been some of the toughest questions you've had to face, and why were they tough?
Well, I think that some of the tough questions are, you know, just direct questions around information you're not allowed to disclose. So, I think ASX financial information, of course, journalists always try to get information. So then you need to explain to them, look, you might even be a shareholder, but I can't share that with you because it wouldn't be fair. So you have to obviously explain legalities and regulations. So I don't know if that's tough, but it can be quite annoying. I think one of the toughest ones is when, particularly in cybersecurity, when we've been working with clients that have done some really cool things, or, sadly, something like Medibank has happened to them, or Optus or whatever, then you might want to, but you probably something successful case studies that you might want to talk about, but you really can't. Either because you don't have approval from the client, or it just wouldn't be okay to give away some sensitive information that you might be privy to by being an inside partner of that organization. So sometimes you're trying to sort of talk about a case study, talk about a scenario or something that's really interesting and is meaningful, but you maybe can't give away the client name, or you can't give away anything that might sort of lead to that. So I think that's sometimes a very fine line. And sometimes people talk about, oh, company XYZ, or they try to describe the company, or, or they say it was, one of the big two telcos or something like that. That's quite difficult.
Yeah. And it is a challenge, even when we're trying to prepare spokespeople, is to, work out where the line is about what you can and can't say. And look, for the people that are listening in, the advice we always give is don't mention a company or a customer unless you've got that specific permission. I think that's a big part of what you're getting at there as well. So you talked a little bit before about mock interviews and their value. How well did they actually help you prepare? Like, I mean, you mentioned before that, you said that, train hard to fight easy. And I think that, anyone who's played any sport knows that, you train as hard as you can so that you make the game experience as easy as possible. How did the mock interviews kind of help you through that?
Oh, look, I think building a very realistic scenario, so you obviously need to do scenario based training. So you need to be working with someone who can deliver that to you, and then have scenarios where you can prepare for those scenarios and do the training, and also be surprised by some things, because I think the art of learning this sort of thing is not. Look, so sometimes you can absolutely do some of the worst scenario based or mock interview type training. You can actually be terrible at it, and then you go and do a real one the next day, and you probably come off quite well. But I think the secret is also, you don't want to over prepare such that you come across like a robot. People like storytelling, and I think it's important to be able to tell stories authentically and with your own personality. So you don't want to be, reading off a script or replicating that. But I think it, just like anything, it is just a good form of training, and it just gets you mentally adept to be, ready for the worst possible question. Know that you've got a pretty boring answer to that question, so that you've got a defense. But in reality, you're still able to actually talk about some of the key things that you'd like to communicate in the spokesperson role.
So it's interesting when you talk about storytelling. What are some of the tactics you've used? Like, for example, if you're responding to something like a 4C, or financial information that's out in the public domain, and someone asks you, how do you give life to that story? Like, because when people just look at a balance sheet and some numbers, they go, "Oh yeah, well, this is up or that's down or whatever it is." What were some of the? Did you have any tricks to try to bring any of that to life?
Well, when talking about that financial information, first thing is you've got to know the topic pretty well. So don't don't go into a topic if you're sort of half-assed about it, or you know something about it, or your CFO has just given you the latest things. You've really got to understand what the context is around that particular bit of information. And then I think it helps to be able to tell a story as to how this has been built, how you've actually moved towards this, and then what does it mean, for the business? How is that reflected? I think it's very good to relate financial information to the efforts of the people that have created the financial information, because I think, and one of the things we'll talk about is the impact of media spokespeople on your internal workforce and your internal teams. I think that's really important to relate that, so that it's not just seen as, oh, we're a great company, we've done these things and we've produced this financial result and it's quite boring. You've really got to try to build things to how that's related. And that could be in terms of, new customers, new services, new employees that you've actually built, and new services that you've been able to deliver, and how you've been able to make that more efficient, et cetera. So you've really got to sort of tell a storyline around how you've actually produced that. And I think that goes over very well.
So when you sort of talk about, we've talked a little bit now about how you can build a story, add things to it, and make it a bit more engaging and embellish, and not embellishing, but actually just making it interesting for people. Part of that is obviously your engagement with media that comes through PR and through your marketing team. What are some of the key things that you think senior leaders need to do before they actually go and invest in PR and in media engagement? What's some of the stuff you've got to do up front?
Well, the first thing is you need to, depending on what organization it is and where you are in the organization, let's say, assuming you're the leader of the organization, you've normally got a board of directors or you've got a C-level team. You need to get the C-level team and the board on side with what you're doing. You don't want to be out there ahead of the curve saying things that, that's not appreciated by others. So I think that's important to get the entire leadership team on board with the fact that we're going to start to do more PR and and you're going to be a spokesperson or you're going to train a couple of spokespeople up. I think you got to make it part of your plan. Of course, any business needs a business plan. Out of a business plan comes a marketing plan. Out of a marketing plan comes a PR plan. So it's got to cascade in that. It's got to be part of that plan. I think a lot of companies sometimes just go, well, they might have a business plan, but they really it might be a bit all over the place with their sales and marketing. And then they go PR, we need PR, and they just run out and they think, well, what's PR? Let's go and do that. I think it's really got to be part of a cascaded step so that you understand what it is that you're trying to get in terms of publicity. And then I think once you've done that, you must understand that if you're trying to build time with journalists, you must provide availability to them. I think that's one of the most biggest challenges because normally your spokespeople, whether it's yourself or, as you kindly said before, you've trained other people in the organisation, partially because of an availability problem of oneself, partially because I think it's good to actually share the load and share the spokespeople across, selected individuals who've got the skill sets to do it. But you've got to make sure there's availability because news is a very short-term, sensationalistic type of thing, and opportunities come up quite randomly, quite reactively. So you must be able to understand that sometimes the journo's diaries, God forbid, is more important than yours because they might only have a certain amount of time before something bubbles up. They've got a deadline to meet, and if you're not there for them, and because you then simply can't control those headlines then if you're not actually present for them.
Yeah, that was really interesting. We had that a couple of times with Tesserent. I think we had two fairly significant incidents that both broke on Friday afternoons, which is absolutely the worst time if you're trying to get spokespeople because people are heading up for weekends. And I think we had Media-Wize and then CrowdStrike, where Tesserent was able to comment into the media for both of those incidents, and with TV and radio as well as print. And it was about making sure it didn't all just fall on your shoulders. We knew that there was a second person and a third person we could go to if you weren't available, and that worked really well. So making sure you got that backup person is really, really critical.
Yeah. Well, I was well and truly down the pub for the CrowdStrike one, but thank goodness one of my reliable spokespeople did a brilliant job in also reminding the market that it potentially probably wasn't a cyber problem either.
That's right. Yeah, and that worked really, really well. There's another thing there. Often you think you're approaching a story or an interview and with a particular outcome in your mind, but you don't always get to control that outcome. Have you had challenges around that where, effectively you're not in control of that headline?
Yeah, I think you've got to be prepared for disappointments, like anything in life. If you're trying to actually embark on, a public relations campaign and you think you know the story and you have your framework on it, but of course there's a whole lot of other vectors out there in the market, and journalists may not even be experts in your sort of field, and they'll take it a certain way. So you've got to be prepared that the outcome that you might want out of the publicity may not exactly fit with the way you see things. And that can be very frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. And having worked on both sides of that fence, even as a journalist, it's frustrating when someone comes back, but you didn't tell the story I wanted you to tell. So, you've got to make sure that everyone's kind of, you understand what the journalist is looking for, as well as what you're trying to tell, and try to find the bridge between those two things to join them up so that it all works. You were talking about availability before, and we we're kind of thinking really, probably talking more in the context of being just available for radio, TV, one of those, very quick, got to be out there in a few minutes kind of opportunities that sometimes happen. But there's also written stuff that goes out there. When you're writing thought leadership pieces, obviously, and there's media releases and pitches and all the other stuff that goes out to the media in different forms. there's also an obligation on you to make sure that either you or an approved person is ready to approve that copy. Is that something you've had to set up internal processes to manage effectively?
Yeah, I think it comes out of sort of selecting an internal team to do it, but obviously most companies also have, an approval process for things to be released and so on. In terms of a public company, sometimes things have got to go to the chairman. In Tesserent's case, it was almost impossible to find the chairman at a good time, but without a board meeting. So, luckily we were able to do a fair bit of PR, through my approvals. But the problem is, I think getting the draft done, getting other people to look at the draft, getting, then the final sort of approvals, and then sort of being able to hit the deadline. And once again, I think it's just reminding the fact that sometimes, the media has deadlines. That sometimes, if you really want to participate and build build a credible public relations campaign, you have to actually invest time into it. I think a lot of companies that I see and I hear about sometimes make it very frustrating for the PR person internally or the advisor they might have to get things done.
Just for people on the call, if you do have questions for Kurt or want to make any comments, please feel free to do that either through the chat or the Q&A function on the webinar software. So just hit the button, throw your message up, and we'll try to get to it as quickly as we can. Let's talk about some of the outcomes that came from the PR and the work that you guys did to enhance the Tesserent's reputation while you're in charge. How did media coverage positively enhance Tesserent's trust, credibility, and market share?
Well, first thing I would say is it didn't do anything instantaneously. That was the first thing. This was something that probably it didn't take months. It took probably years to build. It's something that, you've got to do over time. So while sometimes you can hit a headline and you can put yourself out there and that can just, generate a lot of, inbound traffic, inquiries and that sort of stuff. I think generally speaking, it was really just around building the fact that, we were there as a business and we had a credible team of people and we were across the issues. So I think it took a fair amount of brand building to our clients, because our clients were evolving over time. We were growing the size of our clients, the number of our clients. A lot of times in the early days, we'd be engaging with clients that had never heard of us before, particularly when we were a very, very small ASX company, or some of the companies that had joined the team from being privately held to being acquired by Tesserent had no one had ever heard of Tesserent. They'd heard of the sub brands, and we went through a long period where the sub brands were more notable than the Tesserent brand. So, but after about 2 or 3 years of hard work from a lot of people, clients, we would engage with a new client and they had heard of us. So that was good. In terms of, I think a point I really want to make here is one of the things that's not often spoken about that I think a good PR program did for us was it actually gave a lot of confidence to our internal teams. So I think that's something a lot of companies don't realize, that when you're buried within the bowels of a company and you're working on a small piece, you do understand if the company's out there in the press making an announcement or talking about a case study or something like that. I think it's very confidence building to the internal teams to know that at least they've got that air cover and they've got, a media spokespeople that are out there actually talking about some of the positive things that they are doing.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. We've had that comment from people in the past where one of the big benefits comes when the sales guys walk in to a new prospect. They're not unknown. They go, oh,
Yeah.
we've not just that they've heard of you, but there's reputation attached to having heard of you. It's not just, oh, we saw Tesserent's name somewhere. It's like we saw Tesserent and they talked about this thing and we recognize, they were actually thinking about that in a way that was really important or interesting to us. So it was really building reputation as well as recognition, those things going together.
Yep.
You had to do a lot. You had to do quite a few interviews around finance, around company finances, and particularly in the early days when we started working with you, you went through a lot of acquisitions. I think it was 11 or 12 or something acquisitions at the time.
16.
16. Oh, there you go. 16 acquisitions. There was rebranding, integration, all of that stuff. And obviously when you're in that acquisition mode, people are like, who's your next target? And you'll know who the next target is, or you're already in negotiation, but you can't be public about that. How did you kind of balance that need to be transparent about some things, but also maintain confidentiality? Was that tricky to balance?
Yeah, with that one, I think I mentioned it very briefly before. Is I think it was just about reminding the journalist and the audience that some information it's not privy to our wider shareholder base. So, as much as I would love to be able to tell you, Anthony, about who our next acquisition target is and what they do and how they come, and it's really really exciting. And if I say this, it might even push the share price up. I'm sorry, but I can't because that's information that's not available to the wider shareholding. So I would always fall back on that one. But I think it's about planning and expecting the questions. So as I said before, if you go back, you build a plan, you think about what's the worst case questions you can have. That would be one of them. And also asking about obviously the financial aspects. We haven't released our 4C yet, so I can't talk about that. But what I
Mm.
could say is it's looking like this or like that. You have to be careful.
Yeah. So trying to keep things general and give enough
Yes.
to have something, but not too much to break the rules.
I think always got to give context on why, because otherwise you just sound like a politician just trying to avoid a question. So you've always got to give context.
Yeah, and that is critical. It's kind of interesting because when you talk about some of the future, and people are often asking you what's next, what's coming. That can be a very tricky tightrope to walk. I want to just kind of talk specifically about cyber. Like we've kept this fairly high level at the moment, but let's just dive into cyber a little bit. Do you think cyber's well covered in Australia? Do you think there are enough people actually who are dedicated to covering the sector? And what if you kind of had to rank the quality of cybersecurity reporting in Australia at the moment, like on a score of maybe say, let's give it from 0 to 10. I'll put you on the spot a bit. Where do you kind of think it sits at the moment?
Oh, probably 6 or 7. I mean, I think it gets good coverage when there's an incident. It gets good coverage when there's something, when the government is about to release or has released its new strategy. It gets coverage if Microsoft or Amazon or Cisco say do something about it. But I think generally speaking, no, I think the Australia has probably not many dedicated reporters around cyber. There's probably a very small handful, and even those perhaps are more do other things. So I think it's not something that's it's not too bad, but I think I'd put it at about a 7, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I mean, I think when I started doing cyber reporting 15, 16 years ago, whatever it was, there was about 6 or 7 of us that used to just travel all together. Like you'd go to a security event, and we'd all be there and we'd all be covering it. It was a pretty supportive little community that we had going, but it doesn't seem to be anything like that at the moment. The number of people dedicated just to cyber it's a far smaller number than that. I'm going to throw
Mhm.
you on the spot. We've got a question that's come in via the chat. How do you handle a situation where a customer has had a breach and you're contacted to comment?
I think, well, the first thing you'd be doing is talking to the customer because they're the one that's had the breach. Usually, if there's a breach, there's probably an incident response plan in place. That might also, hopefully, would also include media and PR and coverage. So you would instantly be falling back to the client and seeing whether or not there's already an opportunity, whether there's a provider in place, whether there's an internal team in place that's handling that when the client was planning on making this announcement, whether they even have to announce it because it may not be something they might need to report and might not want to report. So depending upon what the client wanted to do, it'd be a simple no comment, or it would be actually there's quite a lot to comment. Come and speak to this team here about it. But it would all be client led in that case.
We've got another
But
question from the audience. I just want to, just on something that you just said in there around that question. The difficulty, of course, can come where someone's been breached. We'll call them Company X just for fun. And say Company X gets breached, and they come up and say, "Yeah, look, we have been breached." Blah blah blah. And when the next thing the reporters typically ask is, "So what are you doing about it?" And they'll say, "Well, we have our existing partner, Hanson Cyber, and they've been working with us." And all of a sudden, it's Hanson Cyber's in the spotlight as, "Well, if you've been partnering with them and they've just been breached, what have you been doing?" There's that collateral damage kind of aspect to it as well, which, I imagine that would be, I don't know if you've ever had to face that, but that would be a challenging thing to have
yeah,
to go through as well.
usually clients don't throw their providers under the bus because remember, particularly with major breaches and it's a decent sized client, there's more than one provider, whether it's a consultancy or a product supplier or some type of service provider. So usually clients are not there to throw under the bus. This probably does also fold into another story that chairman I had in the previous company would often, I remember I walked into his office one day, and he was a bit more elderly gentleman with his big oak panel desks, and every day he'd read the Australian and the Fin Review. And particularly, well, I'm going back a few years now when there was probably cyber incidents appearing every week. And I think we had one of our competitors being named in there a lot. And he basically just said, why aren't we getting more of this media? Why aren't we getting more of this coverage? And I said to him, Jeff, the problem with that is it's very ambulance chasing. And there's two things for it. When our amazing people at Tesserent do things really well, it's actually really boring because nothing happens. So there's never much reporting about when incidences are avoided or things that have prevented a breach and that type of thing. It's always bad when things leak out. So that's the one problem. And I do know one major client we picked up because one of their providers actually went out and spoke to the press around that breach. And and it just obviously wasn't appreciated by the client. So they were terminated and we were given the business. So I think that's an interesting sort of scenario as well. And once again, it's a very fine line.
Another question that's come in is, we talk about, this is quite an interesting question because just last night I did a presentation at ASA on crisis comms. We've got a question in there it's asking us both, what do we think the essentials for a crisis comms plan? Like, from your perspective, what are some of the essentials that have got to be in a crisis comms plan?
Well, the first essential is to have a plan. And that was a great question from a sales perspective. Often I'll use the word sales loosely, but from a conversational aspect, when meeting, a C-level IT or any sort of C-level executive, is to actually ask them, how do you have an incident response plan? Do you have a breach plan? And if the answer is yes, we do, when did you last test it? When did you last role play it? So I think that's really important. And then there's a number of different ways, obviously, of delivering it, and how much you need to use an external provider. I think it always helps to have, from both sides of the fence, it's going to always help to have someone to bring some knowledge in from the industry about what the best techniques are to develop that plan. But every plan for every company is going to be different. But the most important thing is not actually the plan, but the process of creating the plan will build awareness inside the company, so that when the worst thing happens, you at least have people that know roughly what to do, and things aren't going to work perfectly according to plan, but at least people would have rehearsed for this moment and know who to call or what to do or what to say, what not to say, to a large extent.
Yeah, I think when I kind of think about that, and the question was specifically about crisis comms. Pardon me. You can't have your technical response isolated from your external response. Those things do have to work together. So I think, having a crisis comms plan is important, and having a technical incident response plan is important, but you've got to make sure that things actually work together and have the right people in the room to make the right decisions at the right times and to carry out the right actions. Yeah, I think, to take that question a little bit, it's the same as anything. If you're doing an incident response plan, you must anticipate what are the incidents you're going to respond to, and then work out what you're going to do, technically to resolve it, whether that's go to backups or alternate systems or whatever it is, however you've got that plan. But also, if it goes into the public domain, what are you going to do about it? A lot of organizations don't even know who they have to tell often. Do I go to the OAIC? Do I have to go to the ASX? They don't know. So just know who.
But even just getting the right people at the right time in the room together to make the decision, that can be very challenging. If the IT system is fundamentally breached itself, have you got a separate, Microsoft Teams platform, organized that you can move everyone onto that communication, because you may not want to use your existing IT to communicate. There's a whole lot of things that a good plan would have.
Yeah. No, it was a good question. I think, we could almost do an hour just on, crisis comms planning pretty easily.
Yeah.
So I asked you a little bit before about cybersecurity reporting in Australia, and I think your score of about a 6 or 7 out of 10, I think that's pretty reasonable. I think depending on where you look, they may even be a little bit on the generous side, but I think a 6 is pretty reasonable. When we talk about the actual reporting that's going on, do you think the focus is too strongly on breach? It's like breach of the day kind of reporting. Do you think there's enough reporting on actual that helps organizations be a little bit more strategic and think about prevention? We always talk about detect, protect, protect, detect, respond. There seems to be a big focus on respond after the incident, but do we do enough around the detection and protection and talking about that, you think?
No, because it's boring. It's not there's not enough of a story there. So we always go to the when the worst case happens. So there's that's the ambulance chasing. So there's a lot of good things that happen, in terms of security awareness, investments that companies are making. There's the tech, and of course the tech vendors will always push their tech. But on the people and the process side, the programs and the commitments and some of the time and effort that companies have been putting into defending themselves, there's not, it's not an exciting story, but it's definitely some really good stories out there that probably do need to be promoted a lot more as part of the journey we're on, not just in business, but as a country.
And I think that's one of the things that you often try to do through the thought leadership pieces that you'd had published in a lot of different platforms is they're not boring stories, they're important stories. They're not headline grabbing stories, but it's actually making sure that those things are actually out there in the public domain for people to learn from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Has anything, obviously in the 25 years you've dealt with media and been a spokesperson, there's probably been some things that haven't quite gone your way. Has there been anything that's really shocked or frustrated you in dealing with the media and dealing with journalists?
Well, yeah. Journalists some of them are freelancers and some of them are part-timers and some of them are more professional than others. But sometimes you'll do a lot of effort to get a story out and then it just won't happen. And then that can be very frustrating. I mean, the one particular story, there was a private girls' school about an hour's drive out of Melbourne that our academy had done a fair amount of work with in terms of training. And this was going into how do we get more women in, not just in cybersecurity, but in IT? And you've actually got really the genesis of it goes back to year 8 and 9, 10 girls choosing the right subjects at high school, which then would lead them into, doing tertiary education more around what could lead them into cyber. So we've obviously had a fair amount of focus on that. So we had a really good case study. It was a really good story to get out there. And I think it was the Australian newspaper, or it was one of the major brands. And so we had interviews done with the teachers and two of the outstanding students. And I drove down there for an hour to get some photos. It was a terrific story. And then we had a photographer who hadn't been approved or something by the journalist and took some really good, what we all thought were really good photos. But because we hadn't used the journalist's preferred photographer because he or she couldn't get there, so I think the school had a photographer who was a really good photographer. We used them. They wouldn't print the story.
Yeah.
And so that was a huge amount of effort from a number of people, and then there was no story. And really, what did it matter? The story was a very good, positive story about a secondary education and a particular teacher who had a passion for, for the girls to do something and had engaged with us, and we'd helped her along the way. It was a really good story, and the two students that were chosen were absolute wonderful role models for anyone. And the story didn't go to air.
Yeah, that thing around images and photos is just, I think people underestimate how important it is to have the visuals that go with good stories. But in that instance, it was just so frustrating because they wouldn't get, they just said, well, you take the photos and we'll use them. And we took the photo and they go, well, we don't like them. So they toss the story.
Exactly.
I must say, just along those lines, we had a client recently who was featured in the Wall Street Journal in the US. And that story almost fell through because we didn't have the name of the photographer that took the photo, because it was someone's headshot, and they wanted to actually credit the actual photographer. And because that headshot had been taken 5 years before, we didn't know who the photographer was. We had to work really hard to figure for the person who was involved to go and remember who the photographer actually was. And that story would have fallen through had we not got that, the name of a photographer just to credit a photo as well. So it's amazing how many little ducks you've got to get in a row for something to actually come together. It can be really challenging that way. So we've got it looks like a couple of other people are about to ask questions through the chat, but I'm just going to ask you one last thing. What's your best advice for aspiring business leaders who want to forge relationships with the media and secure coverage?
I think I've said it a few times before. You need to have a plan. So you need to make a plan within your business and get ownership within the business. If it's a decent sized business, I would heavily encourage having not just one spokesperson. Some people do want to make it about themselves. That, I mean, it does give you a certain amount of control, but I think it also shows a better story if you've got multiple spokespeople, and you need that for availability anyway. Because you've got to invest the time with journos. You've got to be there at the time the journos need you, not when is convenient to you. And then the other thing was you've got to get to know the journos, and to do that, you need to turn up on their ground. So I think we did a fair bit of good work in the last few years, going to some of the journos have retreats. What was the one up in the Blue Mountains, or
Tech leaders.
Tech Leaders Forum? So we spent some time attending the Tech Leaders Forum. We spent time attending the journos awards nights, sponsoring those things. And so over time, the journos get to know you, and then they come to you first to get the message about a particular issue, rather than to your competitor. So it's just about everything. You just got to invest time. Anthony?
Yeah, and I think the other thing is, we often have clients that go, what can we get in 3 months? You know, how much is that going to cut through? And I think one of the things you've alluded to is you've actually got to commit. You don't get the best results in the first month. The first 3 months are setting you up. It's the ongoing program and effort that then builds up, and eventually, as you said, it took a couple of years, but then you really got your story across and started to get more coverage and more people coming to you. And I think, when we look back, I looked at the stats the other day of what the work we've done with you guys. And I think by the end, we're averaging about 300 media clips a year over the last couple of years. So you're getting coverage almost daily on average. I mean, obviously, some days you get a number of things in one day, but on average, you're getting close to a clip every day, because you'd put the work in to establish your spokespeople and yourself as experts. You'd done the thought leadership stuff. You'd made yourself available for interviews. That availability for interviews is super important, because if you're a reliable spokesperson, people will come to you because they know you'll be ready.
Yes, and probably all of that work also probably helped us get the company acquired by a major multinational as well. So, thank you for that.
And I think it was a 4x on the share price as well. So it ended up being a good result for shareholders and for the business as well. There's a couple of, I could see people trying to type there, and they kind of come and gone. So I'm not sure if there's any more questions, but I'll give people a moment if they do have any other questions. Is there anything that you want that we haven't kind of brought out through the Q&A we've done that you really wanted to kind of highlight and focus?
Oh, I think we've covered it pretty well. I think I would probably just say that obviously, if you're going to do media, there's a lot of self-professed media experts sometimes inside companies, and people that have done quasi-marketing roles. I would always go to a professional. So I would turn to somebody like Media-Wize. I probably questioned the value of spending money on a retainer in the past, but I think as long as you're putting effort into the money you're spending externally with a consultant, with a media media consultancy, if you like, then you'll get something out of it. But you've got to be prepared to do it for a couple of years.
Yeah, I think that's the key. The best results we have are always when people are engaged. It doesn't work if you just expect to throw stuff out into the ether and hope for the best. It does have to be partnership and working together. Well, I think the questions from our audience have stopped. Well, if anyone does have any further questions, please pop them in now, because we're going to wrap up shortly. I just want to thank Kurt. Look, I know a few people wanted to log in last week, but unfortunately we had a technical problem which resulted in us not being able to run this last week. So we've had to push it out to this week. But I want to thank Kurt for being super flexible and allowing us to do that. It is tough to get the time of senior executives in businesses, but we do thank him for this time. Thank you for those who asked questions and attended. We will send a link to a recording after this in the next couple of days. So we'll edit it down a bit so that it's nice and crisp and clean and all that sort of stuff. But thank you to those who have been on the call today. Thank you to Kurt. And I look forward to catching up with all of you again one day soon. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, everyone.
Yes.